As a chess coach, one of the things I quickly came to understand is that many players are not improving at the pace that they'd like to improve, not because they're not working hard enough, but rather because they're not working on the right things. A classical example of that would be a player who is spending 20 hours a week working on chess, but 18 of those are spent studying opening theory. Now, while opening theory is very important, what is the most important thing as a chess player is to constantly work on your chess fundamentals. But what exactly are fundamental mistakes? Well, in this video, I'm going to cover 5 of the most common mistakes that I see that I consider to be fundamental mistakes, and that apply all the way from beginner level through to intermediate level, right up to advanced. And all of the games here that are selected are games taken, recent games from the same player who is rated 1800 in online blitz chess. Okay, so the first one I want to speak about is piece activity. When it comes to piece activity, there's 2 things that you want to be doing. Number 1, you want to increase your piece activity as much as possible. Number 2, you want to reduce your opponent's piece activity as much as possible. So let's take a look at this game and see what happens. Okay, so we're really kicking it off right here in this position. And white has just played the move pawn to d4. White has a great position out of the opening, has a strong center. Now, black captures on d4, which I don't like because black is giving up this center. And now black places the bishop out to b4. Now, in this position, what I'd like to see is an improvement of piece activity through development, knight to c3. Instead, white plays rook e2. I'm not a huge fan of that move, but it's also not the end of the world. Black plays rook to e8, tackles the pawn on e4, and now white kicks back the bishop. A move that I like, kicks back the bishop again, and the bishop has to drop to b6. Now, in this position, black continues to have this, or has renewed this threat now that the bishop is safe. And white needs to respond to that threat. Now, the way to do this is to play a developing move that will increase your piece activity while keeping the harmony of your center. Knight to c3. White would have had a commanding advantage here because basically black has failed in their mission in the opening. They haven't been able to break down white's center. Now, instead of this, white decided to play in this position the fundamental mistake of pawn to d5. Now, if you look at it from the lens of piece activity, look at this bishop. Once this pawn moves forward, piece activity has dropped tremendously for the bishop. It's now almost a pawn. On the other hand, look at black's bishop. The bishop has now, piece activity has increased tremendously for it. And now let's look at the black knight. In fact, let's look at black's response. Knight goes to e5. So by playing this move, pawn to d5, 3 things happen. Number 1, activation of black's dark squared bishop. Number 2, loss of activity of white's light squared bishop. And number 3, the opportunity for black's knight to gain a very strong footing in the center. So what does black do? Black goes knight to e5. White has to eliminate this piece. And now after rook takes e5, white's next move is king to h1. Now, a lot of players, what they'll do when they're analyzing games is they'll just look at this position. They might see that the computer says it's roughly equal. And they'll say, damn, this is the move that cost me the game. But much of the time, mistakes come in pairs. And in reality, the move that cost white the game, or at least a big chunk of what cost white the game, was this earlier move pawn to d5. Because after knight e5, knight takes, rook takes, there was pressure against this pawn and also pressure along this diagonal. And white was seeing this, wanted to address this, forgot the pawn, and then it was game over. So shortly after this, white ended up resigning. I mean, the position is completely lost. They're behind in development, and black's pieces are just absolutely beautiful here. The second mistake I want to speak about is what I call mindless trades. All right, so we sort of focus on this position here to begin. And what I noticed reviewing this player's games is that they were really focused all the time on seeking out exchanges, but not really for any particular reason. I think they just enjoyed trading pieces. And that's a common mistake that people make. Maybe they don't like how complicated the game of chess can be, so they just want to chop off pieces and make it simpler. Now, there's a time and a place to trade pieces, But if you do it all the time, it's going to sting you. Okay, so here's the example. White goes bishop to b5 in this position. Now, what white should be doing is focusing on developing, but instead, white seeks out a piece exchange. Now, black blocks that, and white now exchanges. As a consequence of this, black is now a little bit better. Why? Because white has not only spent time, they have to move the bishop again, but has actually fortified black's control of the center and even opened up the semi-open b file. White now drops the bishop back, knight goes to f6. What happens next shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. Bishop goes out to g5. Black asks the question, what are you doing with that bishop? And white follows through. Now, white has managed to get a bunch of exchanges, but the consequence of this is black now has a better center and has the bishop pair. So that's really not a very good deal. Now, white goes c3. Black plays d5. And in comes the next opportunity to exchange, and sure enough, the player takes. Now, there's another element within this, which is if you have this tendency to exchange pieces, once your opponents notice this, especially if you have like players who you're playing more than once they start to notice this, they're going to start to bait you, and they're going to start to give you opportunities to exchange their pieces or to go for an exchange when it's not good for you. So it's a double whammy. It's like, it's not only a bad habit, but it's also a very exploitable habit. Okay, so c takes d5, queen goes to e2, and now let's take a look at what happens. Castle, knight goes back to d2, or sorry, knight goes forward to d2. Black now grabs the center. Black is just absolutely doing fantastically here. What should white be focused on? Disrupting black's center. So the best move is something like pawn to c4. But instead, where is the focus? Seeking exchanges. So bishop to b5. Well, this is actually a bad move. Black could have simply captured and gone rook b8 and won a clean pawn as a result of this bad exchange. Now, after bishop to f5, I mean, I really, if the player who played this, I don't wish to. I hope that they don't take offense to this example, but I had to laugh when I saw this particular sequence here. This is a player who is absolutely hell-bent on exchanging pieces whenever possible, and this particular sequence that's coming up is quite amusing. White goes queen h5, tackles the bishop. The bishop drops back. Queen g4. Now, you might be wondering, where is that queen off to? Well, sure enough, it goes to d7. And now when the queen gets hit, it finally achieves nirvana here. Goes queen to c6, looking for the exchange of queens. But the reality is, after rook to b8, white gets the trade. Rook takes. White has spent 14 moves, just trying to get the queen off the board. And in the end, in the meantime, black has just placed everything fantastically, right? So this is something that you need to be very, very careful. If you're in that habit, in my view, it's a lazy chess player habit. I know, because I have that tendency myself. When you're feeling a bit lazy, you just exchange. You want to exchange stuff. You don't want to think so hard. You don't want all the pieces on the board, but be very, very careful with this because it's costing you games. You saw here a good example of that. So let's move on to the next common mistake. Okay, so we're now going to speak about attacking too early. Now, in this position, the same player whose games we've been following is on the back foot. The reason why they're on the back foot is because there's pressure against this pawn on d4. Black has a strong grip over the only open file in the position, the c file, and white is kind of trying to generate some sort of attack on the king side, but nothing much is happening. Black has way too much counterplay on the queen side, and with fast possibilities, white has to recognize, hey, I'm on the back foot here, and I need to be reactive before I can later on be proactive, right? I need to earn my right to attack. So that's a really important point. Earning your right to attack. How do you know if you should attack or not? The position will tell you. If you start to attack just because you feel like it, your attacks aren't going to work out and you're going to have bad results. That's exactly what happens here. White at first defends the pawn. That's correct. Black gangs up on the c file. Now white goes for bishop to g5. Makes sense, looking for an exchange of that important defensive bishop. Black declines, and white plants the bishop on f6. This is the first significant mistake. What white should recognize here is that sooner or later, black is going to break down the position on the c-file. The rooks are going to start to enter the game. So what white needs to be doing is playing a move maybe like h3, just solving against any back rank problems. Maybe a move like queen f4, reinforcing the pawn on d4 to maybe give the right of this rook to challenge on the c-file, and just try to weather the storm. Instead, white focuses on the attack. They go bishop f6, and now after a5, they go rook f4. The second you do this, you lift up your rook. What you're doing is you're compromising your back rank, because now there's two rooks that can potentially invade you, and one of your rooks is no longer there to defend. Why is white doing this? They're looking to generate some kind of attack along the h-file. But black has the two bishops defending their king, the queen, and a healthy pawn structure, as well as counterplay here on the queen side. So it's just, there's no right balance there for the attack to work. So after rook f4, what happens? b4 happens, a takes b, knight goes to e2, and sure enough, black invades, and black is completely winning. Previously, the position was a little bit better for black, nothing major. Now white's position has collapsed, and they're completely uncoordinated. In desperation, white tries to put the rook on h4, and here black actually made a mistake. They went bishop to g7, but the simplest move is to just call the bluff. Rook takes, and yeah, if you want, you can play rook takes h7 and sacrifice another piece, but in the end, you know, I'm not going to go back to g8 and let you checkmate me here. I'm just going to block with bishop h6, and you're out of ammunition, right? The only way that you could continue your attack is with a move like bishop to g5. Yes, you'll win this bishop, but I have many ways to play. One, maybe the simplest way is rook h8. When if you go queen takes h6, there's kind of an amusing way in which white's queen gets trapped. But that's neither here nor there. The point, the most important point, is that here in this position, white needed to be realistic. Black's attack was stronger than white's attack. Black had sort of earned the right to attack because their pieces were really well placed. White had not, so they needed to defend. They chose to attack not because the position called for it, but because they wanted to. Maybe that's the style that they associate themselves with. As Magnus Carlsen once said, he doesn't believe in styles because styles are weaknesses. The big point that he's making is, you know, I want to play the position at all times, right? We arrive to mistake number 4 that I see very often, and that is a mishandling of the bishop pair. Now, what we actually can see in this position, black is doing very, very well because they have a little bit more space on the queen side here with these pawns. White's pawn structure is kind of weak, and black's pieces are slightly better placed overall. Notably, this bishop on d1 is not very active. Now, what white plays here is they play g4. Knight goes to d5. White targets this bishop. Now, black rather, white plays king g3, defends the bishop. And here now, the easiest way to win, by the way, was to play this move pawn to c3. This was absolutely the easiest way because you break down this structure, and white is in serious trouble here. I mean, for example, pawn takes, knight takes, the bishop doesn't even have any squares to run, right? So this is what we were speaking about. That bishop was the problem piece for white, and there was a good example of profiting from that. But black instead takes a different approach. Knight e3, nothing wrong with that. And if white moves the bishop, then the pawn on c2 is going to fall. So what does white do? White captures, bishop takes, black now has the bishop pair. Black has gained because of the fact that their position was better. White was put under more and more pressure, and eventually white had to give up an asset, which was the bishop pair. Now, in this position, white plays bishop to e2, looking to activate. And what black should do is recognize, I've got the bishop pair. This is a very strong piece because it's uncontested. My opponent can't fight me on the dark squares. Can I cause damage on the dark squares? Now, if you look at this position, of all of the white pawns, 2/3 of them, 4 out of 6, are on dark squares. So look for ways in which you can use your dark square bishop to target those pawns. And the move here would have been bishop to c1. After this, white can pretty much resign because they're going to lose a pawn here. And what's worse is we're going to end up with a really strong pass pawn supported by our bishop pair. So that's fundamental endgames and the use of the bishop pair. Instead, white's earlier habit of wanting to trade pieces mindlessly comes back to bite them. What do they play? Bishop takes f3. And now fundamental endgames as well as mindless trading as well as the value of the bishop pair, they're all combining, right? Why do I say fundamental endgames? Because there is a very, very important endgame concept, which is if you have opposite colored bishops, the probability of a draw, if the pawns are equal or even if one side has one pawn more than the other, is huge. So if you're pressing your opponent, this is the one scenario you want to avoid if possible. Now already the position is objectively equal. Black had this idea of bishop d4 in mind. Probably that's what sort of motivated to capture. The knight was covering that square. So they say, okay, bishop d4, now I'll win one of these pawns. But the problem is, in the end, you can see that it just morphs into this endgame. In fact, actually, white ended up painfully, or rather black ended up painfully losing this game, although of course the position is equal. But they should never have been in a situation where they just capture on f3 and, in one move, they give up the bishop pair and with it all possibilities of winning. And finally, the very last common chess mistake. I call it pieces in enemy territory. Probably there's a sort of a nicer way of framing this problem, but it's a very common mistake that I see, which is basically if your opponent has pieces in your half of the board, the more advanced into your half, the riskier for them, and vice versa. If you have pieces in your opponent's half of the board, you need to watch out that those pieces aren't just going to be abandoned because they're really deep in enemy territory and they can easily get picked off if you're not careful. So one of the common mistakes that I see is a player will, place a piece, especially a slow-moving piece like a knight, deep in enemy territory, and they sort of forget about it, focus on other stuff, a little bit of home cleaning, develop, move a pawn here and there, just completely forgetting about their piece. That piece gets snapped up and with it the game. So in this position here, we can see white is doing pretty well. They have an attack. They need to be careful that they don't ignore their development, but they have some pressure here and the black bishop isn't really doing much. So overall, they're doing okay. Now, black goes king h7, natural move, just looking to defend the pawn, and white plays f6. Which is a sacrificial idea, with the point being after you take my pawn, I'll take your pawn. Not a huge fan of it, but it's also, it's fine. It's the position still is roughly in the balance here. But where things start to go wrong is black plays rook to e8. White, again, I like this move, knight a3. They need to develop the knight. But you have to be a little bit careful. Maybe a natural move here would be bishop f4. My piece is in enemy territory. This is the only piece. Black has no pieces in enemy territory. They only have a pawn. And that's not a big deal. It's well protected. And I do. So I have to be a little bit careful with that bishop. Now white goes knight a3. Black plays bishop to d7. And now white continues to focus on development and plays rook to e1. And immediately with this move, they're completely losing. So why is that? Well, black now plays rook takes e1. The bishop in enemy territory is what I call loosely defended, meaning it only had one defender, which means that white is stuck for options which way to capture this rook. They have to take back with their own rook. As a result of this, it opens up a nasty tactical idea here for black. g5, locking the bishop away, shutting off this diagonal, and with it, ending the game. White can just resign. The focus on developing the queen side was correct, but they needed to take one move out of that plan for the higher priority play, which was get that bishop out of the way. Now, if you're wondering, wait a second, if after bishop takes h6, if this g5 idea cost white the game, why didn't black play it straight away? Well, if black played it here, that rook was hanging. So black needed to spend time with rook e8. Now, after knight a3, why not play it here? That's a much trickier answer, but the point is that white had this clever resource here, queen to f2. With queen f2, this bishop gets targeted, and you might be thinking, well, I'll just protect my bishop and then I'll win this one. But one tactical resource would have saved white and indeed won the game. Bishop takes g5. The point is, after bishop takes bishop, queen takes f7 is check, and the rook is falling, so white would just be winning. So that's kind of a little bit of an aside for anybody who was kind of curious as to why g5 wasn't working before. But even if you don't see all of those tactics, it's good practice. It's like good chess hygiene that if your piece is stuck in enemy territory, or is far deep in enemy territory and it isn't doing anything, then why not just pull back that piece, unless you absolutely need to spend your move on something else, right? But in this case, the difference between losing this game immediately and maybe going on to win it was down to the fact that white needed to have just taken a move, save that bishop, consolidate the position, then continue developing. And I actually like white's position here because of the fact, after a position after a move like this, I like white's position because this bishop is a little bit weak, and in the future perhaps the black king will be a bit in a little bit of trouble here along the f file and the open h file. But that's neither here nor there. That concludes the 5 common mistakes that I wanted to run you through in this video.